Okay, so just as in early 2022, here's a video I never thought I'd be making and never wanted to be making, because it's fairly rare for any political leader to make a single decision, which shakes the very foundations of the global economic or strategic order. And yet I'd argue that's what happened when President Trump stood up and declared the United States would be imposing the highest tariffs the country has seen in the better part of a century. As markets slide around the world, the impacts of that announcement are already being felt internationally. But today I basically want to stop and ask what just happened, why did it happen, and what might be coming next. First, we're going to go through the US announcement itself and some of the tariffs that are going to be slamming into place. Then we're going to get under the hood a bit, looking at some of the method and assumptions that appear to have sat behind these tariff calculations in order to ask whether these actually are reciprocal tariffs as they're being described. I'd argue they're not, and what some of the potential implications and complications are of the US using the model that it is. In the second half of the episode then, we'll pivot from the tariffs themselves to the trade war they're going to potentially cause, asking how it may play out and what leverage and vulnerabilities the United States has going into it. Finally, we'll close out by discussing potential alternatives. What are some of the things countries could potentially do instead if they wanted to achieve these kind of industrial goals without immense economic collateral damage? Up front, alongside traditional caveats like this not being financial advice and all the other good stuff that you can read in the caveats below, I do want to make a point about potential bias. Within the field of economics, different people are going to have different philosophies and different approaches to problems. I primarily deal in defense economics, for example, and so I'm probably more predisposed to support things like tariffs or restrictive industrial policies, because I'm often going to be much more focused on things like preserving potentially strategic industrial capacity or supply chains, not just maximizing on-paper free market efficiency at all costs. I don't have a general ideological like for tariffs, but acknowledge that strategically they have a place in the toolbox. So I'm coming at this from the perspective that countries like the United States might have a reason to try and protect their manufacturing base, and might need to use various trade tools in order to do it. I'm just also of the opinion that if that's the problem they were trying to solve here, then the approach they've gone with is somewhat akin to using a brick to remove a brain tumour. But before we get into why I would argue that, a quick word from a sponsor. To say that 2025 so far has been an eventful year would probably be a podium-worthy understatement. And in that kind of environment, it can be hard to keep pace with the sheer number of news stories coming out, while also being sure that where possible, you're seeing them from all the angles. If we click through these headlines on America's recent tariffs, for example, you'll see a difference in what information different organisations choose to put front and centre. This one focuses on the base 10% floor rate, for example, while this one also flags the higher tariffs on a range of countries, as well as the threat of escalation if countries choose to respond with their own measures. The tool being used here is long-term channel sponsor Ground News. What it can allow you to do is quickly compare how a given story is being covered by reportedly drawing on more than 50,000 news sources around the world. Alongside that, it also gives you useful contextual information. Elements like factuality ratings, reportedly based on the work of 3 independent news monitoring organisations, or information on the ownership of a given media source. And beyond just potentially helping you better understand the sources you're reading, Ground News also has some nifty additional tools. The blind spot feed, for example, isn't a silver bullet for the challenge of online echo chambers, but essentially what it might allow you to do is surface stories that are primarily or overwhelmingly being covered by the kind of media sources you might not ordinarily consume, something which might help give you a better understanding of what others are seeing and reading. I've been a long-term Ground News user, and if you'd like to be too, there will be a link in the description, one that will give you access to a 40% discount on a Ground News Vantage plan. And so with my thanks to Ground News as always, let's get back to it. So let's start with what was actually announced. As President Trump was giving his speech ushering in this new tariff-heavy era, he showed the world a chart. On it, under the heading Reciprocal Tariffs, there were 3 very simple pieces of information. A list of countries, a column labelled Tariffs charged the United States, including currency manipulation and trade barriers, and then next to it on the far right, the number the markets were really going to care about, the rate of additional tariffs the United States was going to be placing on imports from that country. Vietnam, as you can see there for example, was claimed to have a 90% tariff charged to the United States, with the US planning to lift its tariffs on Vietnam by 46 percentage points. President Trump obviously didn't speak through every country during his speech, but the White House later released a full list. And essentially, it looked like a tariff them all and let God sort it out approach. Just about everyone trading with the United States was going to be hit with at least something, although there were a few notable exceptions. Russia and Belarus, for example, didn't make the list, even though Ukraine did. It was later claimed that this was due to US trade with Russia being so low because of sanctions on the country, even though some other sanctioned countries like Iran and Venezuela were hit, and many of the places impacted had lower trade volumes with the United States than Russia does. And by lower volumes, I mean lower volumes. A lot of media attention, for example, focused on the fact that the Heard and McDonald Islands had copped a 10% US tariff, That is an image of one of the islands on the right there, complete with some of its only permanent inhabitants. Despite being labelled a country on the White House list, these are uninhabited external island territories of Australia that are home to exactly 0 humans, but a couple of volcanoes and a shit ton of penguins, who I can only presume are known for their particularly aggressive trade practices. Originally I wondered if these islands might have just been getting tariffed by default, because they're Australian territories and Australia also comped a 10% tariff, but then we saw that another Australian territory, Norfolk Island, this time with a massive 2,000 people on it, somehow managed to attract a tariff almost 3 times higher than the rest of Australia. So your guess is as good as mine. The one that really caught my attention though was the British Indian Ocean Territory, which copped the same 10% tariff rate as the UK proper, but actually only has a small population, the overwhelming majority of whom are there because of the sole military base on the island, the American military base on the island. Meaning you could argue that at least to a tiny extent, we didn't just see the US place trade barriers on penguins, we saw America place trade barriers on Americans. But as funny as stories about tariffed avians might be, I'd argue the who in this story is less important than the what. Not who was hit with tariffs, but how big they were and why. If you listened to Trump's speech and saw the chart, you'd think there is a very simple methodology here. This was labelled as a reciprocal tariff initiative, which is where you put tariffs on someone because they put tariffs on you. This chart seemed to list those tariffs, and then a reciprocal tariff, quote unquote, that the United States would now be charging, equal to half that supposed tariff and trade barrier in the middle column. If South Korea had a 50% tariff on the United States, for example, as the chart suggests, the United States would respond with a 25% tariff. And we heard some language of that kind during this speech and some of the surrounding explanations. The words sometimes used were, quote unquote, charging us. For example, country X is charging us 60%, so we're going to charge them 30%. The reason that framing matters, I think, is twofold. Firstly, because it presents these new US tariffs as a responsive, defensive and understandable measure. The US is allegedly being hit with something and they're hitting back half as hard. The second reason that matters is because that's probably bullshit and the numbers in the middle column are not what you might think they are. One of the first responses from many analysts in other countries when these announcements were made was absolute confusion, because they did not understand where these claimed tariffs being charged the United States were coming from. According to the middle column in that American document, the European Union, for example, hits the United States with a combined tariff trade barrier of 39%. The 39% figure was deeply confusing to the Europeans because the World Trade Organization estimates the EU's average tariff at about 4.9% in 2024, and the European Commission reportedly said the following, quote, "Nevertheless, considering the actual trade in goods between the EU and US, in practice, the average tariff rate on both sides is approximately 1%. In 2023, the US collected approximately 7 billion euros of tariffs on EU exports, and the EU collected approximately 3 billion euros on US exports. If you do the basic math there, if in 2024 the US exported about $370 billion worth of goods to the European Union, a 39% tariff rate would have been expected to collect about $144 billion worth of revenue, not a number in the single digits. Now, what that number wouldn't capture on either side is the impact of trade that ultimately didn't happen because of any potential trade barriers, but you probably get the picture. That then leads to a question. If this number on the reciprocal tariffs chart isn't actually a tariff, what is it? Because while a lot of interviewees were shrugging their shoulders and saying they didn't know where the number came from, or wondering if it might represent a monstrously complex formula intended to capture the effects of a wide variety of trade barriers, some analysts quickly came to believe that they'd reverse engineered this number. And their contention was often that it didn't directly measure trade barriers or tariffs at all, nor was it particularly complicated. It didn't appear to be a measure of trade barriers so much as a measure of trade balance, with this chart showing that the supposed calculated tariffs basically followed the formula exports minus imports divided by imports. Digging a little deeper though, we did get a rebuttal of sorts from the Deputy Press Secretary at the White House, responding to a post that said, quote, "They didn't actually calculate tariff rates plus non-tariff barriers as they say they did. Instead, for every country, they just took our trade deficit with that country and divided it by that country's exports to us," end quote. The White House responded, quote, "No, we literally calculated tariff and non-tariff barriers, and then critically, they posted a method, with that formula down the bottom being the key to how these tariffs were calculated." And just so you can be sure that I'm not playing around with this explanation, I have posted the extract and labelled the various values for you. What that equation basically says is the change in tariff rate should be equal to exports minus imports divided by the product of imports and two elasticity values. We don't really need to go into the theory behind elasticity though, because the model doesn't try and calculate them, it just defines them. And they set the first value at 4 and the second value at 1/4. meaning everyone who remembers their primary school mathematics probably knows where this is going. The calculation clearly isn't exports minus imports divided by imports. In practical terms, it's exports minus imports divided by imports multiplied by 1. This is not a tariff measurement, it's a trade deficit measurement. And there's at least one other twist here. International trade includes both goods and services. But it appears that when they were using that formula, the United States might have left out services and chosen to focus only on goods. I did some very rough math to check that theory, and I think we might be onto a winner. If I take the publicly available figures for goods exports and imports between the United States and the People's Republic of China, I end up predicting a 34% tariff rate, which is what was announced. If you include the trade and services though, the predicted tariff drops to about 30%. The impact is far, far more dramatic when you look at countries like Switzerland. If you only include the trade in goods, the formula will say the Swiss are charging a 61% tariff quote-unquote on the United States and call for a 31% US tariff in response, which is what was announced. Add the trade in services as well, and the US tariff drops from 31% to closer to 9%. And those numbers might give you some clue of the impact of leaving services out of this calculation. As you can see with the chart here, using US data, the United States runs a massive trade deficit when it comes to goods. But when it comes to services, the US actually runs a very large surplus, which is much larger now than it was in the early 2000s. And so the net result of leaving services out of the equation is to make trade look more unbalanced than it arguably is, and in this case, generate much higher quote-unquote reciprocal tariff values. As a side note here, if you go to the website of the Office of the United States Trade Representative and delve through some of the country profiles, you might notice something interesting. Back in 2024, this is what the page for Switzerland looked like. It said that, at the time, the United States had a goods trade deficit with Switzerland of $22.7 billion US dollars, that it had a trade surplus in services of $21.5 billion, and as such, the total balance in goods and services was basically even, a deficit of $1.1 billion. It also noted that in terms of foreign direct investment, Switzerland had invested almost $100 billion more in the US than the United States had in Switzerland. If you had no other information and just looked at these figures, you might conclude that this was a very fair, relatively well-balanced trading relationship. There was a net cash outflow for goods, but a net cash inflow in other areas. Look at the website now, though, and everything other than the trade in goods has been deleted. No mention of a trade surplus in services, no mention of foreign direct investment, just a trade deficit in goods of $38.5 billion. The page on the People's Republic of China has undergone similar treatment. This is what it looked like in 2024, and this is what was there at time of recording. So we have a situation that might be described as the US claiming to impose reciprocal tariffs based on an equation that doesn't actually directly measure tariffs and trade barriers and only covers a part of international trade. The next question I have then is why, at least officially. What is the logic behind imposing quote-unquote reciprocal tariffs based on that calculation? The White House has actually put up a page discussing the calculation and some of the logic behind it, and it gives us some pretty good pointers on the goal behind this calculation, as well as the assumptions that go into it. And arguably, they are absolutely wild. Firstly, it makes no attempt to identify all the different tariffs and trade barriers out there and calculate their individual impacts. Instead, it seems to imply that if there is a trade imbalance, country A is buying more from country B than vice versa, then you know what? That's probably because of tariffs and trade barriers. Quote, while individually computing the trade deficit effects of tens of thousands of tariff, regulatory, tax, and other policies in each country is complex, if not impossible, their combined effects can be proxied by computing the tariff level consistent with driving bilateral trade deficits to zero, end quote. Now, leaving aside the fact that modelling the impact of thousands of different policy settings is kind of why you would have economic advisors in the first place, the first thing that strikes me is just how overly simplistic that model is, basically assuming away all of the complexity. My first thought, particularly given some of the oddities some of you have probably already noticed here, is that it kind of felt like the sort of thing that an undergrad student might get ChatGPT to punt out 3 minutes before an assignment is due because they're panicking and haven't had time to calculate an actual answer. And so just for fun, I decided to see how ChatGPT would handle this problem. I gave it the following prompt, quote, what would be an easy way to calculate the tariffs that should be imposed on other countries so the USA has an even playing field when it comes to trade deficits? Set the minimum tariff to 10%. You can see the equation it spat out in the middle there. Tariff percentage equals desired reduction in imports divided by imports and then turned into a percentage. That's what the times by 100 means. If you take that formula and assume that you want to reduce imports until your trade balance is zero, that formula becomes your trade balance, so exports minus imports, divided by imports, and converted into a percentage. Functionally, so leaving out those cancelled out elasticities, this is the formula. Although notably, when I asked the bot to start using that formula in some examples, it also basically warned me not to use it, saying the tariff in question would, quote, be an extreme policy choice and it would likely have significant, mostly negative economic consequences, before going on to list some of those effects, including inflation, consumer discomfort, potential Chinese retaliation, disruption of supply chains, a slowdown in the economy, and long-term damage to trading relationships. So, yeah, however the White House actually came up with this formula, it's kind of similar to the result that AI gave me, with a massive warning label. So make of that what you will. In any case, leaving aside the possibility that the global economy might be on fire because of AI-generated trade policy, let's go back to what the administration itself has said about it. The basic goal of the calculation is described as, quote, reciprocal tariffs are calculated as the tariff rate necessary to balance bilateral trade deficits between the US and each of our trading partners, end quote, at which point it becomes abundantly clear what this model is actually trying to do. It is attempting to calculate, and I use the term loosely, a tariff rate which will give every US trading relationship the Thanos treatment. Namely, with every country, US exports and imports will be perfectly balanced. No surpluses, at least until we get to a caveat they added in a moment, and no deficits. Now, it makes a range of wild assumptions in order to do that, including saying, quote, assuming the offsetting exchange rate and general equilibrium effects are small enough to be ignored, end quote, which is a pretty gutsy assumption when you're assuming that foreign exchange rates won't respond to you taking a pickaxe to the global trade system. But the assumption that hits me the most is the idea that any trade deficit must be the result of unfair dealing and merit a reciprocal tariff, rather than, different countries having different resources, different comparative advantages, and so very different needs when it comes to exports and imports. As one senior administration official reportedly put it, quote, tariffs are customized to each country based on the concept that the trade deficit we have with any given country is the sum of all the unfair trade practices, the sum of all the cheating, end quote. Which is kind of bonkers when the calculation page itself seems to acknowledge that that's not how this works. It's not how any of this works. It refers to trade deficits being persistent because of tariffs, non-tariff policies, and fundamentals. And that F word here really matters, because I'm going to assume they're using that term to refer to certain basic economic realities. Fundamentals, or comparative advantages, are the reason that even if you had a zero-tariff free trade environment, trade would still take place, and it wouldn't be equal between all countries, because different countries fundamentally have different strengths and weaknesses when it comes to global trade. An example of a fundamental might be what resource deposits are in a country, how's the climate of a country, what does labour cost in a country. Because if you had a trading system where you had two identical countries and the only difference between them was that one of them had oil and the other one didn't, you can bet the drill baby drill crowd would be running a trade surplus, not because of anything unfair on their part, just because they're the ones with the valuable resources. Essentially, when you're saying it's fair to put in place a reciprocal tariff because another country has a fundamental advantage, you're saying they need to be punished for being good at something or having something you don't have. And the idea that you can crush a trade imbalance caused by fundamentals using tariffs is a tad questionable. Tariffs might shift investment logic and trade patterns, but they're not going to change where in the ground the bloody gold deposits are or make coffee grow in Scandinavia. Nature and history has just dealt different countries different hands. Even if you decided there was merit in the idea that a country should implement policies to lower its overall trade deficits, the idea that every single bilateral trading relationship should also be perfectly evenly matched falls apart the moment you think about it on any smaller or practical scale. If you had states within a larger country with no internal trade barriers, you'd still expect to see uneven trade. A desert state with a bunch of mines might run a trade deficit with other states as it brings in things like food, water, and services, in order to enable it to run a trade surplus with the rest of the world, selling the products from those mines. A bilateral trade balance of zero is not a default state, and I'm not entirely clear why you'd want it to be. And that leads to a section I've just labelled complications, where I want to highlight some of the potential weirdness if you take this approach, where you assume that any trade deficit, whether it's caused by actual barriers or just fundamentals, is automatically a case of a country ripping you off, so to speak, meriting retaliation. And on the flip side, any country running a trade deficit with you is in the good books, no matter what their policy settings are. And I'd argue that economically, it's just not that simple. It's possible to have a fair trade deficit or an unfair trade surplus. To take an extreme hypothetical example, if you found a poor resource-rich country, invaded it, and then forced them at gunpoint to sell you gold for $50 an ounce, which is a fraction of what it's actually worth and constitutes outright robbery, assuming they can't buy any of your stuff in return because, they're broke because you're stealing all their gold, on paper, this model would look at that situation and conclude that that trade was monstrously unfair against the invader. and it would suggest slapping those dodgy rip-off miners with a full 50% tariff rate. It doesn't matter essentially whether the US is getting a good or a bad deal on its trade, just that the trade is happening. It doesn't matter if the US is able to buy discounted Canadian oil, which it then refines into more expensive products and sells on to its own people or other countries at a massive profit. Canada, the calculation suggests, still has to be punished for selling them the oil in the first place. What this means is you could potentially have massive trade barriers on the United States and not attract a high tariff as long as your trade is relatively even. If on paper you should have a massive trade deficit with the United States, for example, but you impose tariffs to even things out, the model will say that's fair. But as soon as relative volumes get out of whack, here come the tariffs. And if you're wondering what kind of countries that might punish the hardest, it's going to be those that sell raw resources or cheap goods into the United States, but are too poor to afford most of the higher-end goods and services that the United States actually produces. Vietnam, for example, is near the top of the list with a 46% tariff. In economic terms, Vietnam is a low-cost manufacturing centre, which America actually encouraged many of its allies and companies to move production to in order to get them out of China, which supplies the United States with a lot of affordable goods because labour in the country is relatively cheap. But in part because labour in Vietnam is so cheap, most of the consumers there aren't going to have the financial resources to purchase the kind of things that America exports. Hence the trade deficit. The country that got hit with the maximum rate tariff, Lesotho, is a landlocked country of about 2 million people in Africa with a nominal GDP per capita of about $900 per person. A lot of their exports to the United States are cheap textiles, things like jeans, which are partly produced there because of a program the United States set up to try and support export industries in some of these very poor countries to lift some of their population out of poverty, and presumably to bolster American soft power and influence in the region in a way that might actually be cheaper than providing direct aid. The people of Lesotho get jobs, America gets influence and lower inflation. The model, however, looks at that trading relationship, sees a deficit, and apparently concludes that because people earning perhaps $160 a month aren't exactly in the mood to spend their entire lifetime earnings splurging on a new Ram 1500, they are obviously ripping Uncle Sam off, so it's time to slap a 50% tariff on a good chunk of this impoverished nation's GDP, because how dare they, I guess, do exactly what the US's African Growth and Opportunities Act wanted them to do. Basically, not for the first or last time as we go through this, you have a case and equation seeing a wonky trade balance and deciding that that needs to be punished, whereas perhaps if a human policymaker looked a little bit closer at that particular trade situation, they probably wouldn't have slammed the tariff button. The model, unless it's changed, also comes with some perverse incentives for other countries dealing with the United States. It essentially punishes some things it probably shouldn't, and doesn't punish at all a lot of the things it potentially should. Foreign direct investment doesn't matter, services don't matter, actual trade barriers don't matter, all that matters is the trade balance in goods. And things get particularly problematic when you realise that the model, as implemented, actually comes with a bit of an asterisk, and not a small one. The basic logic of the model is that trade deficits in goods are unfair. I disagree with it, but that's what the model seems to suggest. So you'd probably assume then that it treats trade surpluses in goods as super fair, and a reason to thank a trading partner, not to punish them. And if you just apply the equation as written, that's true. It would actually suggest that countries that have a trade deficit with the United States should impose their own tariffs in order to even stuff up. In practice, though, the US tariffs haven't done that. Whenever that equation would spit out a tariff rate below 10%, the US has defaulted to 10%. Basically, even when the model says there is nothing to retaliate against, the US has decided to retaliate anyway. Some countries like Australia and the United Kingdom that do have trade deficits with the United States have found themselves in that position. As the Australian Prime Minister put it, quote, a reciprocal tariff would be 0, not 10%. The perverse incentive then is if you're a country running a small trade surplus with the United States and being hit with a 10 or 11% tariff, there's actually no point in you doing what Washington says they want you to do, which is buying more American stuff and shifting that trade balance closer to even, because it's never actually going to lower your tariff below 10%. On the other hand, if you're a country that's already doing what Washington says they want you to do, buying more American stuff than vice versa, the model doesn't actually reward you for being a good friend. It slaps you with a 10% tariff anyway, and it doesn't by itself give you any reason not to actually put up some trade barriers and get yourself to a narrow trade surplus with the states, where once again, you're still going to be paying 10%. The basic point here is that even if a country does absolutely everything right from the point of view of the model, you bring down all your own trade barriers, suppress your own exports, you make it compulsory for every household to own an American-built pickup truck on pain of life in prison, the US, by this policy, is still going to hit you with a supposedly reciprocal 10% tariff. And in a world where a lot of businesses run on fairly tight margins, in a lot of contexts, 10% is still massive. As such, I'd argue you can't call this a reciprocal tariff policy, it's just a tariff policy. And through the rest of this presentation, that's how I'm going to be referring to it. If we had more time, I could go on about various other perverse incentives or weaknesses in the model. Carving out services, for example, means that if other countries choose to retaliate against the United States by going after US services exports, as the European Union is now talking about doing, as far as the US model is concerned, that damage is actually invisible and doesn't merit any kind of response. Does that actually mean the US won't respond if the EU goes after US tech firms in Europe? Of course it doesn't. It just means the model being used as a basis to upend the entire global trade system has a massive Silicon Valley-sized hole in it. There are also obviously risks to the status of the US dollar as the de facto global reserve currency, while it also seems to suggest that if you just set the right tariff rate, eventually the global trade system will equalise, leaving aside the practical impossibilities of doing that, let alone quickly. But if all of that mostly has to do with what tariffs are being set and why the White House says they're being set, the next big question then is, are they actually likely to work? Because if one of the core goals here is to encourage companies to manufacture products in the United States rather than bringing them or components of them in from abroad, all else being equal, there are a couple of factors that might make tariffs more or less effective. An effective tariff, for example, might be highly predictable and long-lasting. If it's going to take a company 2, 3, 4 years to set up a new productive facility in the United States, and then maybe a decade on top of that in order to pay off that investment, then they're going to want to know that that tariff is going to be in place for at least 12, 13, 14 years. Because if it potentially disappears after 3, they might have just made a massive capital investment in a facility that is no longer profitable, something that could easily kill hundreds of millions or billions of dollars in investment. Similarly, if companies are looking at reconfiguring their international supply chains in order to bring in more inputs from countries with lower tariffs, like UK or Australia, rather than the European Union, that might be an expensive and risky endeavour if there's a chance that tomorrow new tariffs are imposed that blow up the economic logic of the entire endeavour. This is part of the reason why there's often a tension between trying to use tariffs to guide investment decisions and using them as leverage in negotiations. If you want to use them as bargaining chips in negotiations, you have to be willing to trade them away and drop them in order to negotiate a result. But if you want companies to invest on the basis of those tariffs, they need to be confident that they're not going to be traded away and will stay in place for the long term. At the moment, I think the market has reason to be very uncertain about what the future of US tariff policy is likely to look like. At different times, President Trump has hinted at both options, saying both that tariffs give enormous leverage in negotiations, suggesting they might be traded away, while also reportedly posting on Truth Social, quote, "To the many investors coming into the United States and investing massive amounts of money, my policies will never change," end quote, suggesting they won't be bargained away and instead uses long-term economic levers. Until the uncertainty between those two competing approaches is clarified, businesses might have a reason to play it safe. Then there's an additional aspect of uncertainty, which might get in the way of these tariffs accomplishing what the Trump administration says they want them to achieve. Ultimately, a lot of business decisions aren't just going to be about US tariffs, but what other countries do in response. Because international trade is ultimately a multiplayer game, and how different countries choose to respond to the US basically flipping the trade policy table is still very much up in the air. After these US tariffs were announced, the US Treasury Secretary went on TV and very publicly called on other countries not to retaliate, basically demanding they accept Washington's tariffs and turn the other cheek. If, however, they chose to respond, for example with reciprocal tariffs, the suggestion was that would lead to further escalation. And partly in response to that, we've so far seen countries adopt one of two broad approaches. Some, like the United Kingdom, appear to be taking something of a wait-and-see approach. They might be drawing up potential retaliatory measures, but are reluctant about actually pulling the trigger. The primary apparent goal here might be to prevent the situation getting any worse while negotiations take place, and the UK potentially leverages the fact that while it has been hit with a tariff, it's a lower tariff than many of its neighbours. The other macro approach, though, would be to fight back, and this is something we expect to see more from the likes of the People's Republic of China or European Union, who have a lot more resources, a lot more economic heft, and can deal with the United States on a more even basis. And in fact, China isn't just thinking about retaliating, they've already started. Both reciprocating America's 34% tariff with a 34% tariff of their own, and also bringing in new export restrictions on things like rare earth metals and products that US industry desperately needs. President Trump then posted suggesting that by doing this, China had played it wrong and was quote-unquote panicking, but I suspect it's more likely that Beijing saw potential tariffs coming and has probably spent a bunch of time and effort at this point wargaming and modelling its economic response options. I guess it's possible they just asked DeepSeek or something, but I think the odds are that something like this was probably gamed out in advance. That announcement has caused even more pain to international stock markets and also potentially put Washington in a difficult position. If they now choose to retaliate to the Chinese retaliation, the economic pain is going to get even worse, especially in the very short term where companies may not have alternatives to China as a supplier in place and are potentially going to find themselves paying ever higher tariffs if they can get access to the goods at all. On the other hand, if they don't retaliate, others might be tempted to do so in order to strengthen their position at any negotiations, hence why you can potentially see trade wars like this one entering escalatory spirals. And in terms of powers that are likely watching this interaction closely as they decide their own moves, the European Union is probably near the top of that list. The European Union so far has said they want to see negotiations, but are also preparing retaliatory measures. What those look like ultimately won't be certain until they're finally announced, but so far it looks like US tech giants might be in the crosshairs. Remember, while the United States does run a trade deficit when it comes to goods trade with the European Union, it has a massive surplus in services trade, which might be part of the reason why we've seen the European Commission president reportedly say, quote, "Europe holds a lot of cards, from trade to technology to the size of our market. This strength is also built on our readiness to take firm countermeasures. All instruments are on the table," end quote. That all instruments comment might be a reference to the European Union's anti-coercion instrument, or ACI, a tool that was specifically created to, quote, "act as a deterrent against economic coercion," end quote, and gives the EU a range of powers, including imposing tariffs, restricting the trade in services, or denying foreign companies access to investment opportunities or public procurements. I've seen reports of some European figures describing the ACI as their big bazooka, and alluding to its potential value as a deterrent. Public statements by various European leaders so far have been diverse. Some have counselled caution prior to retaliation, while Germany's economy minister has reportedly suggested that pressure is the appropriate response, adding reportedly, quote, "This pressure now needs to be unfolded from Germany, from Europe, in the alliance with other countries, and then we will see who is the stronger one in this arm wrestle," end quote. Overall, though, it seems that Europe is likely to try at least a little bit more talking, and then, if that doesn't work, start slapping back. Which I think segues fairly well into the next part of this presentation. If this does actually become an escalating trade war cycle, is the US actually likely to win it, or at least lose the least? That question comes back to some of the fundamentals of Trade Warfare 101. If Washington's goal here is to fundamentally reshape the patterns of global trade, there are two broad ways they could potentially do it. Either the tariffs are used as bargaining chips to be traded away in a negotiation for new trade agreements that create the kind of trading environment the United States wants, or you have a no-deal scenario where the US tariffs stay in place as well as whatever retaliation comes back in the other direction, and everyone just hopes that when the dust settles, the new economic equilibrium gives them what they want. In both cases, the fundamentals of trade warfare leverage matter, either because you're trying to get the side to make a deal that favours you, or because you're trying to pressure them not to put additional retaliatory measures in place and just accept the new economic reality. Whether the United States actually wants to negotiate based on these tariffs or keep them in place for the long haul isn't yet entirely clear. When the White House press secretary was asked, for example, whether or not any of these tariffs could be renegotiated or reconsidered before they went into effect on the 5th of April, she reportedly responded that the tariffs are, quote, "not a negotiation," end quote. That matched similar statements by Trump aide Peter Navarro and Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, with Navarro also using the "this is not a negotiation" language. Later, however, Trump himself reportedly took a slightly different tack. Either way, assessing leverage matters here. If you want details on how a country might get leverage or use leverage during a trade war, I've done a previous video on the topic, but just for the here and now, here are some spark notes. Just like in many coercive contexts, the advantage is often going to rest, all else being equal, with whichever side is capable of inflicting lots and lots of pain on their opponent while minimising their own vulnerability. And so often, whichever country is more dependent on the other is going to be the one at a disadvantage. If you have alternatives to trade with, for example, and they don't, then you're the one that has the cards. If they're selling you generic goods that you could potentially get somewhere else, but you're selling them a unique good that only you have access to and they desperately need, then unless they're willing to turn a trade war into an actual war to take those resources from you, you're going to have a much stronger hand going into those negotiations. But we're not talking about a generic trade war here, we're talking about one specifically involving the United States. And so what I want to start to do next is dig into that leverage question. As this all plays out, what are some of the cards the United States has to try and get what it wants? And on the flip side, where are some potential chinks in America's armour? For those key points of American leverage, I think it's worth remembering that we're not in the 1950s anymore, where the United States absolutely dominated the global economic environment. Europe's industries are no longer wrecked from end to end by World War II, and China is now a major economic and military power. But America still has some serious cards to play, and in a non-exhaustive list, I want to quickly cover 4. Military strength and security exports, economic scale, trade deficit and consumer demand, and finally, alliance-driven resilience and influence. The security point is fairly intuitive. The United States has the world's most powerful military and the greatest ability to project that power, and so a lot of countries consider US military protection something particularly valuable. Often that means they might be willing to accept suboptimal trade outcomes if it means protecting their security outcomes. The value of that kind of US security promise may have declined a bit recently, as the US has occasionally cast doubt on the conditions under which it would actually defend its various allies, or suggested it might use military force in order to seize territory from some of those allies, but overall, the military power and protection card might still be a big one in Washington's hand. Secondly, the United States just has economic scale. It's the biggest player on the board in nominal GDP terms, and while there are some scenarios where purchasing power parity, which favours countries like China and Russia, does matter, international trade is done in nominal actual dollars. It's also the world's largest market for a lot of imported consumer goods. That massive trade deficit in goods that the US administration appears to be trying to bring down is actually a massive benefit when it comes to negotiations. Because what that translates to in practical terms is a lot of American consumers and a lot of American businesses willing to buy a lot of stuff from overseas, meaning that if you manage to negotiate yourself access to that market, there might be enormous opportunities there. The United States clearly knows that, and so they can use the prospect of granting or withdrawing that access as leverage during negotiations. Then a final point of historical advantage when it comes to American trade negotiations are the benefits that come from the country's massive network of allies. With that alliance structure potentially allowing the US to exert far more pressure than it could alone, and also protect itself from retaliation far more than it could alone. If the United States is cut out from a particular market, for example, it can potentially limit the damage by rerouting a lot of its exports to all of the other countries that it has free trade agreements with. If a country like China attempts to strike at the US economy by cutting off its access to a vital import, say rare earth minerals, even if the United States itself doesn't have that resource, there are probably some countries in the US alliance structure that do. They then can hopefully step in and limit the damage, and thus the leverage. In previous trade negotiations and trade wars, the United States has used its allies both offensively and defensively. Defensively in the sense that they do provide those alternative suppliers or alternative markets, so it's hard for any other party to critically cut the United States off from anything it desperately needs, and offensively to put an even harder squeeze on potential opponents. With its own tariffs, for example, the US can only threaten about 20% of Chinese exports. 20% is a lot, but potentially non-fatal. If, however, the United States is willing to leverage the relationship it has with its allies and get them to put in place similar barriers, the threatened percentage jumps from around 20% to more than 65%. We've seen the same pattern play out with specific trade restrictions as well. The US can restrict the access a country has to exported American chips, for example, but that doesn't mean much unless that country is also cut off from chips from Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, as well as suppliers of top-tier chip-making equipment, which mostly comes from the Netherlands. The point is, America alone is a scary negotiator at the trade table. America, with its ally swarm behind it, is utterly terrifying. Generally speaking, in the past then, it was a relatively safe assumption that in any one-on-one trade negotiation between the US and any other country, even if you got a lose-lose scenario overall, there were decent odds the United States was going to come out with fewer bruises. With a big market and a lot of friends, it also had a lot of leverage. But if we're talking about negotiating the aftermath of these tariffs now, I'm not sure it's fair to say we're in ordinary times anymore. And if you're looking at this as an opposing negotiator, there might be a couple of chinks in the US economic armour. And so let's flip this around and ask where some of those vulnerabilities might be. I know this might be a strange experience for many of the Americans listening, but if you put on your strategy hat and were put in the unenviable position of having to fight a trade war against the United States, what are some of the vulnerabilities that might let you do it? We can't go over everything, so I'm going to limit it to 6 dot points. Collective action, reliance on alliances, policy imperatives, popular support, political resilience, and the question of asymmetric pain tolerance compared to some of its potential opponents. Collective action risk is just a fancy way of saying that teams are dangerous. As the eldest child in a large extended family, growing up I could easily bowl over one or two of my smaller cousins if we were playing sport in the backyard, but I never underestimated just how quickly things could turn around once 4 or 5 primary schoolers decided that you needed to be taken down a peg. In international relations, those same backyard rules can apply. The United States might be stronger and have more cards at the negotiating table than anyone else, but it doesn't have more cards than everyone else. And by choosing to go after basically everyone in the international trading system at the same time, even those that have trade deficits with the United States, the US is basically committed to fighting a trade war not just on one front or two fronts, but all the fronts. If most of them back down and you only end up having to throw hands with a couple of them, that might work. Similarly in trade terms, if most countries decide to be quiet, take the tariffs as they are in the hopes they don't get any higher, it might work. That doesn't mean the economic outcome will be good, but it might be an outcome closer to what the White House wants. But if these various trade partners potentially start coordinating with each other on collective responses, the leverage and the power dynamics involved might invert. Maybe they reroute trade to each other. Maybe they coordinate tariffs on soft targets. Or maybe they decide to band together to try and tackle supply chain disruptions. Either way, the power balance potentially looks very different than if the US was engaged in a one-on-one, which leads to point 2, where that collective action risk can become even more dangerous. If some of those countries working together or being pushed together are those the United States typically relies on to protect and ruggedize its supply chains. We know the US economy has critical dependencies, critical vulnerabilities, things that it desperately needs from other countries that it cannot supply itself in order to make its economy go. How do we know that? Because US allies have spent decades working with Washington to identify those potential vulnerabilities and find alternative sources for them within the US alliance structure, so the US isn't overly dependent on potential opponents like China to supply it with critical inputs. For example, out of 50 critical minerals identified by the United States Geological Service, the US is 100% import reliant for 12 of them. For an additional 28 of them, import reliance is 50% or higher. And while China is the most important supplier, it's not the only one. Indium, useful in touchscreens, flat-screen TVs and solar panels, comes from South Korea. Scandium for alloying comes from Europe, cobalt from Norway, chromium from South Africa, and a lot of stuff comes from Canada. This is usually not the kind of stuff you can just start producing overnight in an emergency. And if it stopped coming, the US economy would feel it a lot worse than a reduction in the availability of French champagne or Italian cheese. Basically, it's not just about the volume of trade or the size of the deficit, it's about what that trade is. Things would likely have to get pretty damn hostile for US allies to decide to squeeze on those critical vulnerabilities, but the fact that we are even talking about it and the potential damage it might cause to the American economy is, I think, a sign of how far we've already come and what kind of risks are on the table. The next point is geopolitical imperatives. Basically the idea that even though we're talking about American economic goals right now, the United States also has a lot of non-economic goals that can potentially influence trade negotiations, and vice versa. Security and geopolitics in the Asia-Pacific, for example, being a big one. If you want an example of this, the US Defense Secretary has talked extensively about how China is now the US priority and how Japan is a, quote, indispensable partner, end quote, in America's strategy to deter China. That's the security policy goal. And for that to work, the United States wants Japan as strong as possible, as friendly as possible, and as aligned to the United States as possible. And probably not, one assumes, being pushed towards closer cooperation with Beijing. But if economic circumstances, say massive tariffs being placed on major export industries, forces their hand, there's probably a risk from Washington's perspective that trade policy ends up getting in the way of security policy. And in that respect, I'd argue that Washington has already achieved the almost impossible. They've convinced the Republic of Korea, Japan, and the People's Republic of China, 3 countries who famously get along just swell, to sit down and work together to promote more regional trade, and in so doing, shift them a bit closer to each other and a bit further away from the United States. That's pretty close to the opposite of what the United States has says it wants from a security policy perspective. It doesn't mean the old alliances and relationships are over, far from it, but it does potentially demonstrate that actions can have reactions. But if you actually were a strategist looking at the United States for potential weaknesses in these negotiations, security or economics might not actually be the Achilles heel. Instead, you might want to focus on the 3 more political ones: popular support, political resilience, and asymmetric pain tolerance. With that first one, popular support, obviously being a factor in any democracy, and also probably the most intuitive of these factors. Statistically speaking, there are a couple of things that are very clear about politics in the United States. 1, this is a deeply polarized country. President Trump has a lot of incredibly motivated and vocal supporters, but also a lot of detractors. And while you will know as another country that the American people have a very diverse set of views when it comes to this particular president, you also know they tend to vote based on the economy, don't like tariffs, and absolutely hate inflation. Public polling tends to show that Americans are much more negative about Trump's trade negotiation, economic, and Russia-Ukraine policies than they are about the presidency as a whole. Even before these tariffs were announced, polling found that Americans generally disapproved of Trump's trade negotiation strategy with other countries by 60% to 38%. His handling of the economy, 58 to 40, and his handling of the Russia-Ukraine war, 56 to 41. Another earlier poll found that 90% of responding Democrats, 69% of independents, and 57% of Republicans said they were very or somewhat concerned about tariffs, and for a potential recession, numbers were even higher. If I'm looking at this as a counterparty, I'm probably going to conclude that most Americans are probably fairly negative on tariffs, and even within the Republican Party, support is far from universal. You'd also note that these figures predate the recent tariffs and the effects of them flowing through the economy. Potentially exacerbating that public opinion vulnerability, if you like, is the fact that tariff-related pain is likely to hit a lot sooner than any potential upside. Even if firms decide to set up more productive capacity in the United States, doing that in many cases is going to take years, as we said. What you might expect to see more of in the short run is existing excess capacity being used, reductions in capacity being cancelled, or some companies deciding to hedge their bets, so to speak, or some companies that are capable of moving some things more quickly, potentially seeing what they might be able to get set up in the space of months or years. But you would expect any inflation or supply disruption caused by these tariffs to hit a lot sooner than that. Estimates of just how much pain obviously vary. Based on what's been announced so far, one ING piece estimated the impact at about $1,350 per American, and I also found estimates of per household cost running from the low twos through to the high 5,000 range. For buyers of specific goods or services, the effect could potentially be more pronounced. For example, quote, for a typical vehicle, tariffs could add an extra $8,000 to the purchase price, end quote. Those are the kind of numbers where you have to assume that consumers, many of whom are living paycheck to paycheck, are probably, if nothing changes, going to notice that hit. Based on that, if I'm a foreign country looking at this, I might assess that American public support for tariffs is pretty weak already, and the public appetite for more tariffs and more potential pain is probably more likely to weaken than strengthen over time. That's just what the data suggests so far. By contrast, public opinion in a lot of the countries being targeted with these US tariffs is very different. The polling on the right there, for example, covers a number of the European states that have been targeted. In every case, a majority of respondents expect US tariffs to hurt. That suggests they also expect retaliatory tariffs to hurt if this becomes an escalating trade war. But in every case, and by massive margins, they support their governments retaliating anyway. Of the countries surveyed, support for retaliation was softest in Italy, but even there, respondents who wanted to punch back outnumbered those that didn't by more than 2 to 1. In Germany, France and Spain, the ratios were even higher, with another survey I found putting the German ratio at 4 to 1, and in two traditionally very supportive American allies, Great Britain and Denmark, British supporters of retaliation outnumbered opponents by roughly 7 to 1, and in Denmark more than 8 to 1. A data pattern like this might be consistent with a population that is generally feeling pretty, to use the technical term, pissed off, or to use an actual relevant term, you might be looking at a rally round the flag effect. There's a general observed trend for groups of humans, even at the national level, when they feel subjected to an external threat or an external force, to rally closely together in response. Support for existing leaders tends to go up, for example, when a country feels like it's been attacked. We need to see more polling over a longer period of time to be sure, but if you're a strategist looking at this, you might think that the population in many of these countries has more of an appetite for a fight than many of their governments do. And if it does come to an escalating trade war, they might be comparatively more willing to accept personal economic pain in order to slap back, so to speak, rather than make concessions or do nothing. All of that is generally theory though, and most of the time practice eats theory for breakfast. Fortunately for us from an analytical perspective, we actually have a recent case study that might give us some clues as to how this could potentially play out. Because before there were tariffs on everyone, there were tariffs on Canada. And a potential example of a phenomenon I might be worried about if I was a US negotiator, which I think we can call the elbows up effect. Because there, a decent amount of the polling data looked relatively similar to some of what we're seeing now. In the US, it appears that public support for tariffs on Canada was fairly weak. The Fox News poll on the right there from mid-March showed 38% of respondents in favour versus 61% opposed, making the tariffs on Canada much less popular with Americans than the Trump presidency itself at the time. By contrast, public support for retaliatory tariffs in Canada, despite all the costs they might potentially bring, was much higher and much closer to some of the European numbers I just showed you. Those in favour outnumbered those opposed by more than 4 to 1. And what we ultimately saw that translate into was a mixture of official and unofficial retaliatory measures. Government did things like imposing tariffs and stripping American alcohol off the shelves, but it was the public more generally that started to act more averse to American goods and cut down on travel bookings to the United States by big double-digit percentages. The reason I bring this up is to highlight that public motivation can affect how a trade war plays out. Motivated Canadians are much more likely to be willing to inconvenience themselves in order to avoid American products, for example, than Americans who are a bit meh on the whole trade war thing were to go out and actively stop trying to buy Canadian products. In a similar vein, we've seen a significant drop in the number of people buying Teslas in many European countries, for example, but European car brands in the United States haven't been having that same experience. And that observation that there might be an asymmetry of public support on either side of this potential trade war leads into the next dot point, the question of political resilience. Basically, how likely are different political systems and different decision makers to stand strong behind painful tariffs if that's what it takes to get a particular negotiating outcome? In the Canadian example, I'd argue the data suggests that capitulation to America's trade demands actually would have been political suicide. If a leader had said this is all too painful, we need to give Washington whatever they want in order to get these tariffs back to zero right now, I'm not sure what their political longevity would have been. But if you're a country trying to assess how resilient the US political system is behind this whole trade war thing, the indicators are a little less certain, but there are things countries can try. One option we've already seen countries like Canada play on is going after politically sensitive targets. Going after Kentucky bourbon, for example, as we've seen some countries do, isn't going to be particularly damaging for an American in Texas or California, but it might have an outsized impact in the great state of Kentucky, which might make things somewhat uncomfortable for elected officials from that state. Recently, for example, when the US Senate passed a motion to remove tariffs from Canada, in what I'm sure is a complete coincidence, both Republican senators from Kentucky crossed the floor to vote with the Democrats. Now, obviously, there's a lot more political logic to that decision than just an attack on one of Kentucky's main export industries, and Senators McConnell and Paul arguably aren't your typical Senate Republicans. And with that motion unlikely to be echoed in the US House of Representatives, it doesn't have any substantive effect. But it does demonstrate a potential chink in the armour of America's leverage. Even if the president can't be convinced to drop the tariffs, maybe Congress can. And if not now, maybe after the midterms or the 2028 elections. And until then, when countries are looking at retaliatory options, they can continue to pursue potentially politically sensitive targets, which isn't just a case of going after bourbon and Harley Davidsons. It's stuff like Chinese measures that disproportionately go after American farmers. The idea is that even if the US can do more raw economic damage to you than you can do in return, which is certainly the case with Canada, you can still go after soft spots that might cause decision makers to waver. Just as in a conventional war, you have to look beyond the raw economic numbers. It's not just about who has the largest consumer market or the most financial firepower. It's not even strictly about who has the capacity to inflict the most disproportionate economic damage. It's also, ultimately, about political will. To draw a parallel, you could argue that Russia's strategy in Ukraine has essentially assumed that even if Russia loses hundreds of thousands of killed and wounded, even though the United States was only committing a fraction of a percent of GDP in assistance, and most of that was being spent within the United States itself, it would still be political will in the United States that would exhaust first before it did in Russia. And if history is to provide us with any wider precedent here, I'd suggest it basically goes like this. Successful actors haven't been successful because they overpower the immense resources of the USA. You don't beat the United States, you just endure it, until eventually, if you're lucky, the US beats itself. As the old saying goes, the United States doesn't lose wars, it loses interest. And the gamble might go that if Americans see inflation going up, their retirement savings go down, and economic indicators darken without a clear light at the end of the tunnel from what was already a fairly unpopular policy, they might lose interest in this brave new tariff-heavy world fairly quickly. And so some countries might be willing to bet that if they don't like the deal put in front of them by the White House now, that if they can just keep their head down or fight it out, then in a couple of years' time, the US might no longer be in as much of a trade war mood. That dynamic obviously doesn't guarantee that's what happens, and it's entirely possible that we see new trade agreements reached. It'll just be that understanding, that political dynamic, plays a role in what the terms might be if and when agreements are reached. In any case, the outcomes are far from certain, and both sides have a lot of cards to play, meaning we can't really be sure yet how any of this is going to end, or what the world's new stable trade rules are ultimately going to be. We know that this US trade policy is going to be incredibly costly. As for what payoff, if any, that cost will bring, only time will tell. And as we get to the end here, because it's what I know, I wanted to come at this problem from a bit of a defense economics angle and use it to illustrate potential alternatives. How potentially in a different scenario, all of this could have been different. Because what strikes me is behind the deeply unconventional trade policy we've seen adopted, some of the core stated objectives here wouldn't really be controversial in almost any country. It's often accepted that countries have an incentive to protect strategic industries and their manufacturing base. It's often accepted that sometimes sending jobs or industries overseas might be maximally efficient, and yet not actually be in the national interest. And if you look at the experience of the US or European defence industrial bases now, trying to build up again after decades of atrophy, you could understand why there might be a policy imperative to keep some industry at home, or at least in the territory of a friend. When a country loses a vital supply chain, that's real. When it forgets how to build something because the experience atrophies, that's real. When a previously prosperous town is essentially killed off because the main employer in town shuts down or offshores, the experience of the people living there is real. It's a statistical reality that free trade has brought massive benefits overall globally. But especially when you factor in strategy and geopolitics, it's not perfect. And when I see interviews with Americans saying they want to see fairer trade practices, they're not always wrong. Some countries do have extensive trade barriers or unfair trading practices. Indeed, there's an argument that the US itself has sometimes acted as one of those countries. The point is not that there are no problems in the global trading system. It's that a general tariff-driven assault on all trading imbalances everywhere in the world at the same time, based on a formula that looks like it could have been vibe-coded in an afternoon, is less a textbook example on how to fight and win a trade war effectively, and more analogous to trying to cook a steak by burning your house down. If you are tariffing penguins, or punishing countries who, according to your model, are doing everything right, then there's an argument to say that you might have it wrong. But since criticism without an alternative presented model is so much weaker, let's go through one, or at least some general rules for what a successful trade war style effort might look like. Step 1. Pick a precise objective and understand it. If you want to reshore a particular industry, make sure you understand everything about it. What are the inputs? How do the supply chains flick together? Who are the movers and shakers? What are the relevant laws and regulations? What are the geopolitical dynamics? What are the skill and labour requirements? What are the infrastructure requirements? What are the financing requirements? And yes, what tariffs, trade barriers, or fundamentals might be in place that cause the industry to currently look the way you don't want it to look. Over the course of decades, modern supply chains have grown up to be incredibly intricate, to the point where even some people in a given industry may not understand how they all click together. But the point is, if you don't do your research, there's a chance that once you start poking around, you might break something you didn't even know was connected. So whether you're trying to onshore machine tools or missiles, make sure you understand them first. Even then, you've only done half of your homework, because you also need to do the Zunze Know Yourself phase, because if you don't understand your own economic vulnerabilities, you might be vulnerable to some form of targeted retaliation. You need to understand if this gets heated, what your opponent might particularly go after, what effect it would likely have if they did, and what your plan is to respond if they try it. I think that's just a reasonable extension of a rule that applies in so many fields of human endeavour, that if you start to throw literal or metaphorical punches, you should probably have a plan to deal with any that get thrown back. Step 2. Where you can, pick one fight at a time. And that's especially true if the party you're going to try and apply leverage to is a powerful actor. That connects to Axiom 3. Wherever possible, make it a team effort. If you have an issue with a country that's used unfair trading practices to dominate a particular industry, maybe you go to your allies who potentially see the same problem and agree that when the time comes to start applying pressure, you do it together. If more countries bring their individual resources and advantages to the table, the chance of the team as a whole having a critical vulnerability might go down. So if you're the United States, hypothetically, if you're saying China is your greatest strategic rival, maybe instead of going after Brussels and Beijing at the same time, you go after Beijing with Brussels. Of course, I'm not saying that's what should have happened, I'm just illustrating the concept. Then you potentially identify as precise a target, as specific a pain point as possible, and the most surgical, precise tool that you can get away with. You might not need to impact your consumers with a tariff on all goods from a foreign country, for example, if you can potentially get what you need with a targeted export restriction or a regulatory change. The idea is to pick a tool that might get you the leverage and results that you need with as little collateral damage as possible. It will often also be worth pairing potential sticks with carrots. If you're trying to build up semiconductor manufacturing in your country, for example, maybe you don't just tariff imported semiconductors, you actively subsidize their production at home. In any case, at this point you have your tool, you have your team, and you have your target. You're into your execution phase. The policy cannon is loaded and ready to fire. And yet, before you do, the first step might actually be to try and talk it out. You're ready, of course, if negotiations do break down, but just about any trade warfare tool you care to name, a tariff, a subsidy, an export restriction, comes with its own costs. And so if you think you have the leverage, maybe you try and cut a deal before that cost is incurred. That to me is actually one of the stranger aspects of the policy we've just seen announced from the United States. They didn't go around to various countries and say, hey, here are what we identify as some unfair trade barriers, drop them, or there might be some serious tariffs. They kept them secret and then dropped them all on the world at the same time, including on countries that had preemptively announced that they were going to be cutting their trade barriers. In a more conventional scenario, the negotiations, demands, and potentially the ultimatum might instead come before the escalation. If you do commit though, remember our rules we discussed earlier about what makes an effective tariff. You need it to be predictable, stable, and effective. That includes potentially giving businesses an incentive and time to adapt. So perhaps instead of opening with a 50% tariff, you and your allies start at 2 or 3%. But you announce that that's going to consistently increase every 6 or 12 months for the next 15 years or so, meaning your consumers and companies that can't move overnight aren't unduly punished, but the incentive is clearly there for a long-term move. Once you've established that setting and deployed the tool, business needs to trust that you're going to stick by it. Certainty might be boosted by you publicly making longer-term commitments, like supporting education and training, so they know the workforce is going to be there if they set up production in order to effectively staff it. And for the sake of credibility over the longer term, if there are negotiations and trade barriers do start to come down, which is a good outcome from an economic efficiency perspective and something that should be pursued, remembering that tariffs and trade barriers do tend to have their own costs associated, so you want to use them to achieve specific goals rather than just cause. When you're negotiating the end to those tariffs, you want to make sure that businesses that were relying on them don't get overly burned. If companies started setting up car production because you had a tariff on imported cars and then suddenly you drop that tariff, maybe you deploy tools like support packages, tax breaks, infrastructure investments, workforce transition plans, or some combination of policy tools so that other companies and other actors can see that if they rely on you to keep your word in an economic sense, they're probably not going to lose their shirts doing it. Business will always include some risk, of course. There's no need for government to cover for all of it. But at the same time, what you really don't want to do from a business confidence perspective is be yo-yoing your tariffs every couple of weeks or so. You want to impose them for a specific purpose and remove them when you can. Of course, in practice, relying on a very simplified set of rules like that to develop a plan might not be the greatest idea. Wanting to take down trade barriers or boost domestic production are very simple, understandable objectives. But international trade isn't. In a sense, you could argue the international economy is actually one of the most complex systems that humanity has ever created. And while it can be quite resilient, as we see from countries fighting destructive wars or pushing through natural disasters, it's usually the kind of thing you want to carefully tweak rather than adopting a move fast and break things approach. And by choosing to kick off an omni-front confrontation against the entire global trading system, based on an equation that basically boiled down to X minus M over M, Washington has now arguably put all of us into somewhat uncharted territory. And how things resolve from here is still highly uncertain. Going into the escalation and negotiation phase, the US does have significant resources, but those have to be matched against the global scales of its apparent objectives. For now, we can wait and see what additional measures are announced, how global economies and governments respond, and where the future is likely to sit on the spectrum from rapid de-escalation up to massive and continuous escalation. But in closing, I think it's worth at least suggesting that almost however this ends, something will have been lost in the process. Its role as one of the initiators and leading forces in the international trade order was arguably always one of the central pillars of US influence and US power, with the US arguably publicly turning its back on a system that it helped create, shape, and lead. There may be implications for America's global role and global influence. But after a very, very eventful week, that's probably a topic for another time. Which brings me to the channel update. As you can probably guess based on how quickly this episode came out, I had actually prepared for an episode like this one, which was mostly going to be focused on the dynamics of a potential trade war between the United States and other countries, including several of its allies, but I was frankly so caught off guard by what was actually announced that the episode had to go through some significant re-engineering. My assumption had been that tariffs would be used, but they would be used in a more economically conventional way, targeted specifically against things like trade barriers or strategic industries, not deployed in an effort to crush bilateral trade deficits entirely. Hopefully, though, you feel the resulting episode struck the right balance, explaining what had happened and the potential complications of that through the first half, before going through some of the cards the various players are holding later on. I think it still might be a fair while before we have a good understanding of what's likely to happen next, if for no other reason than because what's being done is relatively unconventional, and also due to a lack of clarity over what the endgame here is. I think at this point it's too early to rule out just about any outcome, from successful US coercion on a broad scale, all the way through to outcomes that are much less rosy for Washington. Indeed, the only thing that is clear is that there are going to be economic casualties and costs from the process. But I promise once that and the potential strategic implications become clearer, we'll come back to this topic eventually. Until things start to firm up more, we won't know whether we've witnessed a historically dramatic moment or a historically decisive one. But while we wait to find out, let me just thank you for your engagement and support as always, and I hope to see you all again next week.